These are the 20 Space Marine legions of the Imperium of Man. 9 of them would betray the Father who created them. 9 would hold the line against their own brothers, and 2 would be erased so completely that even their names are gone. This is the story of all of them. Not as a list of factions, but as what it actually was. One family, 20 sons, and 20 different ways to end. Begin on Terra, sometime in the 30th millennium, in a laboratory buried beneath the Himalazian mountains. The man we call the Emperor had a plan that had taken him thousands of years to build toward. Humanity had spent 5 terrible millennia cut off from itself, the age of strife, 5,000 years in which the warp turned hostile, the ships stopped moving, and every human world went dark and alone. He intended to reunite it. To do that, he needed an army, and to lead that army, he needed generals, unlike anything that had walked before. So he made 20 of them. They were not born the ordinary way. They were engineered, grown in gestation capsules, each carrying a different portion of the Emperor's own genetic legacy, each designed to be superhuman in a different direction. One would be the perfect strategist, one the perfect warrior, one the perfect diplomat, or engineer, or hunter. Together, 20 of them, they were meant to be the instruments of a reunified human species. He called them Primarchs, and before they were ready, he lost them. The precise circumstances have never been fully recorded, and the accounts that survive disagree. What is not in doubt is the intent. The powers in the warp had learned what the Emperor was building and what it would cost them, and they took his sons before he could finish them. The gestation capsules were breached, and 20 unborn Primarchs were flung through the warp and scattered across the galaxy. 20 different worlds, 20 different conditions, thousands of light years apart. Exactly how it was done is still argued over, and Konrad Kurz died convinced that his father had engineered every step of it. The scattering, Nostramo, the heresy, even the assassin who eventually came for him. He was not the only one who thought so. Sanguinius came to the same conclusion, and kept faith anyway, and went to his grave keeping it. Consider what that scattering actually meant. A being engineered to be the finest commander in human history landed on a feral death world and was raised by whoever found him. Another fell into a hive of assassins, another into a gladiator pit, another onto a world of poison and monsters where the survivors lived on mountaintops above the fog. Each Primarch grew up shaped entirely by the accident of where he fell, and that accident would decide, 2 centuries later, which of them could be turned. The Emperor did not wait for them. He could not. He had already taken genetic samples from each of the 20, while they were still unborn. From those he raised the legions themselves, 20 of them, over the following century, each one keyed to the genetics of a specific missing son. At first only thousands of transhuman warriors, in the end millions, all of them created in the image of fathers who had not yet been found. These were the first Space Marines, and they fought long before any Primarch stood at their head. They were raised in the closing years of the wars that welded Terra into one thing. They were blooded finishing that war, and then they were handed the solar system, and after that the galaxy, under officers of their own kind, titled Legion Masters. And when the Great Crusade launched, most of them went out into the dark, still not knowing whose sons they were. The last legion to meet its father would wait 183 years. Then, one by one, the Emperor found them. The first the Imperium was ever shown was Horus Lupercal, discovered a few light years from Terra, on Chthoniya, a spent mining world, a warren of gang tunnels and hive sprawls, hollowed out from the inside by millennia of extraction. He was given the 16th Legion, the Lunar Wolves, and for the better part of 30 years he fought at his father's side alone, the only Primarch anyone knew about, the favorite, the one the Emperor took everywhere and taught personally. Those years mattered enormously later. Horus had something none of the others ever had, their father's undivided attention for a very long time, and then the loss of it. The rest were recovered gradually. Leman Russ on Fenris, a death world of fire and ice. Robute Guilliman, on civilized Macragge. Sanguinius, winged, on the irradiated wasteland of Baal Secundus. Angron, on Nuceria, torn away from a slave rebellion he had every intention of dying with. A rescue he never forgave. Magnus the Red, on Prospero. Mortarion, on Barbarous. Vulcan, on Volcanic Nocturne. Corvus Corax leading a prison uprising on a moon called Lycaeus, which its freed slaves renamed Deliverance. Fulgrim on Dying Chemos. Perturabo on Olympia. Conrad Kurds in the perpetual darkness of Nostramo. Rogel Dawn among the ice traders of Inuit. Ferrus Manus on Medusa. Jagatai Khan on the steppes of Chogoris. Lion L. Johnson in the monster-haunted forests of Caliban. Lorgar on Colchis, and Alfarius, found last in 981, 183 years after the Great Crusade began, found, according to the records, by Horus rather than the emperor, except that his own legion tells it the other way round. In their account he was found first, on Terra, by the emperor's own hand, and then hidden, kept a secret from the entire Imperium while Horus was paraded in his place. Alfarius told that story himself, and then he said it was a lie. The Alpha Legion has muddied every account of his discovery so thoroughly that no version of it can be trusted. He would not even name a homeworld. As his brothers took world after world in the system where they found him, he denied every one of them. That accounts for 18. There were 20. The 2nd Legion and the 11th Legion existed. Their numbers sit in the sequence. Every other legion is accounted for, and those 2 gaps are not accidents of record-keeping, and that is genuinely all anyone can tell you. Their names are not recorded. Their Primarchs are not named. Their homeworlds, their heraldry, whatever they did, and whatever was done to them, all of it was removed from Imperial history. Not lost, removed. The Imperium's own foundational military record contains a table of the legions, and in that table, the 2nd and 11th entries are struck through with black bars. The text beside them says only that of those that did not survive. Nothing can be said in this record. And here is the part that makes it worse. The people at the top knew exactly what had been taken out. The one time a Primarch asks directly, Corvus Corax, newly found, told that he has 17 brothers, when he distinctly remembers being number 19, the Emperor's face goes bleak. He looks away, and he says, the other 2. That is a conversation for another day. He never has it. His other sons stop asking. What they do instead is mark the absence. Robute Guilliman kept 2 empty chairs at his council table, with 2 blank, undyed banners hung above them, because their absence had to be marked, because places had to be left for them, because that was simply honor. Rogel Dawn, told he had 14 loyal legions remaining, said only, would that it were 15. Vulcan called it, shame enough to bear the grief for 2. 10,000 years later, a resurrected Guilliman still says it out loud. I was one of 20, 2 failed, and the Imperium's chief geneticist is quietly still holding their gene stock in a vault. Everybody knows. Nobody will say the names. There are theories, of course. There are always theories, but an honest account has to stop here, because everything past this point is invention, and inventing it is exactly the mistake those redacted records were designed to make people commit. So, 18 legions, 18 Primarchs, and the largest military campaign in the history of the species. For roughly 2 centuries the Great Crusade rolled outward from Terra, and it worked. Human worlds that had been isolated for 5,000 years were found and brought back into the fold, sometimes by negotiation, more often not. Alien empires that had carved up the galaxy during humanity's absence were broken. At its height, the Crusade was running more than 4,000 separate expedition fleets, and still expanding, and the legions became distinct. This is the part that gets lost when people list them as 20 variations on the same soldier. They were not variations. Each had been raised on Terra, then handed to a Primarch who had grown up somewhere else entirely. and the Primarch reshaped his legion in the image of the world that had raised him. Recruits began coming from the homeworld. The culture followed the recruits. Within a generation, the legions barely resembled one another. The Space Wolves fought like the Fenrisian tribes that raised Leman Russ, oaths, boasts, and enormous personal ferocity. The Ultramarines under Guilliman became the most rigorously organized force in the Imperium, the template every later chapter would be built from, and Guilliman ran an entire realm on the side to prove the point. Ultramar, the 500 worlds. An empire inside the empire. The Iron Warriors took the sieges nobody else wanted, over and over, until resentment was baked into their identity. The Night Lords used Terra as doctrine, because Conrad Kurds had cleaned up Nostramo with Terra, and it had worked, right up until he left. Then it collapsed straight back into exactly what it had been. Decades later he came home and turned his fleet's guns on the one weak point in the planet's crust, a crater he had made himself, arriving there as an infant, and Nostromo burst apart. By then his legion had been recruiting from that rot for a very long time, and the word-bearers, under Lorgar, worshipped the Emperor as a god, and built that worship into every world they took. That last one caused the first real crack. The Emperor was not a god, and had no intention of being worshipped as one. He had built an imperium explicitly on reason, on the rejection of superstition. But it was not the theology that gave them away. It was the paperwork. Somewhere in the war bureaucracy, somebody was totting up how many worlds each legion was taking, and how fast, and the 17th's numbers had gone strange, because they were not moving on. They were stopping on every world they conquered, and building temples on it. Auditors were sent. The auditors came back with what the temples were for. So a little over 40 years before the heresy, the Emperor made an example, and he chose the instrument deliberately. He gave the job to reboot Guilliman. The entire Ultramarines Legion went to the world of Kur. They gave its capital 6 days to empty, allowed it a single distress call, and then burned Monarchia, the perfect city, the finest thing the word-bearers had ever built, off the face of the planet from orbit. The word-bearers arrived 2 months later. The whole 17th Legion was summoned down into what was left. 100,000 Space Marines standing in the ash. Then the Emperor came in person, with his own custodian guard and Malkador the Sigillite beside him, and put every one of those 100,000 on their knees, psychically, whether they wanted to kneel or not. Their own bodies obeyed him against their will, while the Ultramarines stood over them and watched. He told them they had failed him and failed humanity. He was no god, and would suffer no such belief in his realm. Then he left. His legion got up. Lorgar stayed down. Lorgar knelt. Then he went looking for something else to worship. He found it. In the warp, there were 4 powers who were very glad to be found, and who had been waiting a long time for exactly this. Horus was made War Master, commander of the entire Great Crusade, when the Emperor returned to Terra to pursue a project he explained to no one. From his brother's perspective, their father had simply left, handed the galaxy to Horus, and gone home to do something secret. Then Horus was wounded on the world of Davin. He was taken to a place of healing that was not one, tended by people who were not what they claimed, and shown visions of a future in which the Emperor discarded him, ascended to godhood, and let everything they had built curdle. Whether he was shown truth, or an extremely well-constructed lie, is a question the setting has never answered cleanly. What is certain is that Lorgar and the word-bearers had spent years engineering this moment, and that Horus came back changed. Then, the most persuasive being in the galaxy went to work on his brothers. He did not need to convince them of the same thing. That is the terrible cleverness of it. He needed only to find, in each brother, the grievance that was already sitting there, and give it a direction. Fulgrim wanted perfection, and had begun to suspect it was unreachable by honest means. Perturabo wanted acknowledgement for 2 centuries of the ugliest work in the Crusade. Mortarion despised sorcery, and could be steered by anyone willing to frame the Emperor as the greatest sorcerer alive. Conrad Kurds had always known this would end badly, and had stopped caring. Angron had a slaver's device nailed into his skull, the butcher's nails, implanted as punishment for refusing to kill his own mentor, and they drove him to kill the man anyway, in a blind frenzy, which is what started the slave revolt in the first place. They turned pain into rage, and rage into the only thing he could still reliably feel, and they got worse every year of his life. He wanted the death he had been denied, alongside his slave army. The nails made certain he could want very little else. Magnus had defied the Emperor's edict at Nicaea, which had ordered the legions to stop employing psychers beyond navigators and astropaths, and to disband their librarius departments. The charge of sorcery against Magnus at that council came back not proven, and it was announced that nobody would be censured, but it was no acquittal. The whole ruling was pointed at him, and afterwards his father told him privately that if he ever treated with the warp again, he would visit destruction upon him and strike his legion's name from the imperial records for all time. And then, trying to warn his father of the coming treachery, Magnus treated with the warp and smashed a project of enormous importance doing it, and was marked as a traitor before he was won. And Alpharius was told, by an alien conspiracy called the Cabal, that if the Emperor won, the species was doomed anyway, and that if Horus won, humanity would be extinct inside 3 generations, but would drag the Chaos Gods down into extinction with it. They asked him to choose the second one. That is on the page. Whether it was true is another matter entirely. 9 legions turned, the 3rd, the 4th, the 8th, the 12th, the 14th, the 15th, the 16th, the 17th, and the 20th. 9 did not. The 1st, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 9th, the 10th, the 13th, the 18th, and the 19th. But those 2 lists hide the worst part, which is that the split did not run cleanly between legions. It ran through them. At Istvan III, Horus dealt with that. He had identified the warriors inside his own traitor legions whose loyalty to the Emperor might hold, close to 100,000 of them, across the sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, and the Death Guard. He assembled them on the surface of a single world, on the pretext of a compliance action. Then he dropped Life-Eater virus bombs on them from orbit, and sent their own brothers down to hunt the survivors. Some of them lived. A captain named Saul Tarvitz worked out what was coming and flew down through the bombardment to say so, and loyal officers, still in orbit, got word down too. And because of that, perhaps 2/3 of the men on the ground made it into sealed bunkers and catacombs before the virus hit. Instead of dying in an afternoon, they held the ruins of the Choral City for weeks, and then months, and made Horus pay for every block of rubble. Separately, up in orbit, a single frigate broke from the fleet and ran for Terra carrying the warning, the Eisenstein, and the 70 Astartes who would not turn, all but one of them Death Guard. But the essential work was done. The traitor legions had been all but purged of anyone who might refuse the next order. The next order came at Istvan V. 7 loyal legions were sent to bring Horus to heel. The first wave, the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard, made planetfall and drove hard into the traitor lines. Then the second wave arrived behind them, took up firing positions, and opened up on their backs. The Word-Bearers, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, and the Alpha Legion had been Horus's the entire time. The dropsite massacre broke 3 legions in about 3 hours. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, was beheaded by Fulgrim, who had been his closest friend. More than 9/10 of the loyalist force that landed on Istvan V never left it, and what was left of them would be known ever after as the Shattered Legions. Korax escaped by burning out his flight pack. Vulcan did not. He was taken alive by Konrad Kurtzer, who then spent months killing him aboard his ship, beheading him, eviscerating him, throwing him naked out of an airlock, because Vulcan is a perpetual and simply would not stay dead. Nobody rescued him. Kurz eventually put him in a maze with his own warhammer at the center of it and Vulcan reached the hammer, overpowered him, and triggered the teleporter hidden in its head. It threw him clear across the galaxy, into the sky above Macragge, where he burned up on the way down. The Ultramarines found what was left of him, and it was still alive. After that, it was war, on a scale the galaxy has not seen before or since. Prospero burned. The Emperor had ordered Leman Russ to bring Magnus back in chains. Horus, already turned, convinced Russ that returning Magnus to Terra would be a waste of time and effort, and quietly sent 5,000 of his own legion and 12 Titans along to make sure of the outcome. The assault force was not only Space Wolves, it included the Custodes and, critically, the Sisters of Silence, whose anti-psychic nature is the reason it worked at all. Magnus did not resist. He was waiting for his father's punishment. He had already bargained with a power in the warp a century and a half earlier, without ever fully understanding what he was dealing with, and in the ruin of Tizca, he gave in to it completely, to save the 1,242 of his sons who were still alive. The word-bearers ambushed the Ultramarines at Calth and cost them more than 119,000 legionaries. The muster had been Horus's idea. He declared an Orc empire at Gaslak a growing threat and ordered both legions to gather there. And the Orcs were real enough, but the urgency was not. He admitted later, to Lorgar, that he had fed Guilliman false intelligence, and 6 years earlier, Nicaea had stripped the legions of the Librarius, the one weapon that might have answered what the word-bearers brought with them. The Blood Angels were lured to Cygnus, and very nearly consumed there. And at Fall, the Iron Warriors ambushed a third of the Imperial Fist's legion, translated in inside firing range, and destroyed 36 companies in the first 4 minutes. And then, it went wrong for them. Perturabo commanded in person. He was losing, his fleet mauled, his flagship boarded, the advantage gone, and that was the moment Dawn's recall order arrived. The Fists knew that obeying it meant forfeiting the victory. They obeyed anyway, and fought their way out at terrible cost. A third of the fleet survived the withdrawal, and it ended, as it was always going to, at Terra. The Siege of Terra was the largest battle in human history. Only 3 legions were in the Sol system in force when it began: the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, and the White Scars, and for months they held walls that could not be held. 10,000 Dark Angels fought their way in later. At the end, Horus lowered the void shields of his own flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, and invited his father aboard. He had done the arithmetic: kill the Emperor now, before Guilliman's reinforcements arrived. The Emperor went. He took Rogel Dawn and Constantin Valdor with him, and he ordered Sanguinius to stay behind and hold Terra. Sanguinius refused. He told his father that he had already seen his own death at Horus's hands, and that he was going to go and beat it. That was enough. The Emperor changed his mind and gave him a company. They were separated in the corridors. Horus sprang the trap and scattered them through the ship. Sanguinius reached Horus first, which is what Horus wanted, because Horus still believed he could turn him. He could not. Sanguinius was already wounded from holding the Eternity Gate against a bloodthirster and against Angron, and he knew, having seen it, that he was going to lose. He attacked anyway. He wounded Horus several times before the end. Then Horus killed him. The Emperor found his favorite son standing over the body of his most beautiful one. Daemons had strung the corpse up. His first act was to order it taken down. What happened next has been told 2 ways, and the second one does not contradict the first so much as finish it. The Imperium's own version, the one that has persisted longest, holds that the Emperor could not bring himself to strike until Horus obliterated a single mortal man who threw himself into the gap. The definitive telling keeps that man. He dies exactly as the legend says he dies. But it adds the part the legend forgot, that at the very end, the Chaos Gods pulled their power back out of Horus to teach their servant what he had always been, and Horus understood, finally, and begged his father to kill him. The Emperor hesitated, then he granted it, and told him he was forgiven. Horus died, the rebellion lost its center, and the Emperor was carried out of that chamber broken beyond any repair. He was placed on a device called the Golden Throne, which has sustained him ever since, for 10,000 years, as something neither alive nor dead, and the Imperium worships him as the god he specifically told them he was not. The traitors did not surrender. They fought a long retreat, and most of them fled into the Eye of Terra, a wound in reality, where the warp bleeds into real space, where time does not run straight, and where their patrons could reward them properly. Not all of them. The Night Lords went east, to a fortress world called Sagualsa. The Alpha Legion mostly just dispersed, and there they stopped being legions in any meaningful sense. 6 Primarchs ascended to daemonhood, Fulgrim, Angron, Magnus and Mortarion, during the war itself, and Lorgar and Perturabo in the ruin that came after it, immortal, immensely powerful, and no longer capable of the thing they had originally been made for. Perturabo bought his elevation with the gene seed of more than 400 captured Imperial fists, and Mortarion, at least, could not stand what he had turned into. At Terra, he admitted to Magnus that he hated his own demonic shape and lived in constant pain. Horus was not among them. The Chaos Gods had pulled their power back out of him at the end, to show their servant what he had always been, and what the Emperor killed was a son who had finally understood and asked for it. There was nothing left for Chaos to raise. Conrad Kurds was not among them either. What happened to Kurds is stranger, and the usual telling gets it backwards. He did not arrange his own death. His father did. The Emperor personally dispatched half the Calidus temple to kill him. Kurds simply saw the assassin coming and let her come. There were no guards between her and his throne room. Every scholar who has studied it since has drawn the same conclusion. He cleared the way for her. He ordered his legion not to avenge him, a last wish they eventually disobeyed, and then he sat down and waited, not to prove his father wrong, to prove himself right, that an Imperium which preached justice would answer defiance with murder, exactly as he always had. The killing was the argument, his last recorded words, on the assassin's own vidlog before the feed cuts out. Death is nothing compared to vindication. The sons of Horus collapsed without Horus, tore themselves apart in a civil war of their own, and were finally reforged as the Black Legion by the warrior who had been Horus's first captain. He lifted his gene father's body with great tenderness, the accounts say, and then detached the killing claw from its arm and kept it, and resolved to use it to throttle the Emperor. And the Alpha Legion left a record so contradictory that its loyalty, its chain of command, and even the death of its Primarch, remain arguable 10,000 years later. Rogel Dawn killed Alfarius on a fortress moon above Pluto, and then buried it. He hid the death from his own side, and promoted every man who had witnessed it, specifically so that Alfarius would not even have the honor of being known to have died. So that is not the account the Imperium keeps. The one it keeps is the other one. Guilliman killing an Alfarius on Escrador, years later, half a galaxy away. Nobody can say with confidence whether that one was the Primarch, or his twin, who took his brother's name the moment he felt him die, or simply a legionary, wearing his armor, which is, of course, exactly the point. For the loyalists, the ending was different, and in its own way just as final. Robut Guilliman looked at what had just happened, at how nearly the Imperium had been destroyed by a handful of men, each commanding 100,000 transhuman soldiers, and concluded that the legions themselves were the flaw. No one should ever again hold that much power. So he wrote the Codex Astartes, and in the second founding, the 9 surviving loyalist legions were broken up. Each was reorganized into chapters of roughly 1,000 warriors, autonomous from one another, their chapter masters answerable to no authority but Terra itself. The Ultramarines, 250,000 strong before the heresy, and left with 119,000 dead at Calth and 28,000 more crippled beyond fighting, were split into more successor chapters than anyone, and it very nearly caused a second civil war. The man who refused was Rogel Dawn, who had held the walls of Terra. He would not accept that his father's legions should be dismantled. Leman Russ stood with him, Jagatai Khan and Korax stood with Guilliman, and for a while the Imperium had loyalist space marines under open suspicion of heresy and an Imperial Navy squadron firing on an Imperial Fists cruiser called the Terrible Angel. Dawn gave in eventually. He spent 7 days in the pain glove first, and then he complied. But his legion came apart 3 ways as it went. The core of it stayed Imperial Fists, and still is. The younger and more biddable went to Alexis Pollux and became the Crimson Fists. And the Zealots went with Sigismund, who did not defy the Codex so much as answer the accusation, declaring an eternal crusade to put the Fists' loyalty beyond any possible argument, and taking his Black Templars out into the dark. They are still out there, 10,000 years later, still fighting as roving crusades under a high marshal, and still giving the Codex nothing but lip service. The Space Wolves never accepted it either, and they did the division exactly once. Half the fleet, half the armories, half the priests, handed to a single successor chapter, the Wolf Brothers, who mutated so badly the Inquisition disbanded them, and then Fenris never tried again. 10,000 years without a successor, until the very end of the 41st millennium, when the Ultima Founding finally gave them stable ones, and every man in them is Primaris. Meanwhile they kept their great companies, 12, where the Codex asks for 10, and the Dark Angels complied. Mostly, quietly, without making a scene, and a legion under the eye of a newborn Inquisition, carrying the secret they were carrying, had every reason not to make one. Underneath the compliance, they kept their Calibanite ranks. They kept 2 of the 6 old Legion wings, as the Death Wing and the Raven Wing, and they kept an inner circle the Codex never imagined. What they were hiding was this. Luther, the man the Lion had left in command of Caliban, in what was really an exile dressed up as a posting, declared against him during the heresy. But the reckoning came after it. Returning from the Great Scouring, the Lion found his own homeworld's guns firing on his own fleet. The orbital bombardment cracked Caliban's crust. Then the Chaos Powers, finished with Luther, threw a warp storm at what was left, and the planet came apart. The Order's fortress monastery survived behind its force fields, and that fragment is the rock the Dark Angels still fly today. The traitors of that schism were scattered through space and time by the warp, and they are hunted still, by the sons of the Legion they were part of, and by every chapter descended from it. The Dark Angels would burn a world before letting that story out. As for the Primarchs who survived the war, almost none of them lasted. Jagatai Khan spent 70 years hunting the Dark Eldar who had been stealing his people. In 84, 7 centuries before any of his brothers were lost, that hunt took him into the Maelstrom and through a warp gate into the Drukhari's own webway. He has not been seen since. His sons do not mourn him. They insist he is still hunting. Rogel Dawn was lost in 781 during the First Black Crusade, leading a final boarding assault on the bridge of a Chaos flagship. Nobody who went with him came back. All that was ever recovered was a single skeletal hand, and to this day his sons will not say he is dead. They say he is missing. Leman Russ told his wolves that his life's breath was all but spent, promised he would come back for the last battle, the wolf time, and walked out of the hall with his guard. He never said where he was going. 10,000 years of great hunts have turned up one thing: his armor, abandoned in a temple on a world called Rudra, at the edge of the Eye of Terra. Corvus Corax tried to rebuild his shattered legion by accelerating its gene work, and the Alpha Legion sabotaged it. What came out were things that should not have existed. He gave them the Emperor's peace himself, one at a time, praying for their souls and his own, then sealed himself in his tower for a year, to the day, begging forgiveness. And then he left for the Eye with 2 words: nevermore. Nobody in the Imperium ever found out what became of him. The records say only that he went looking for penance. He had gone to hunt. He caught up with Lorgar. Lorgar ran, into his own temple, into a hidden chamber, and slammed an obsidian door behind him, and 2 runes burned into the black of it, deny fate. He has been behind that door, in one seclusion or another, for 10,000 years. Since the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half, there have been reports that he has come out again, walking the mortal realms at the head of an army. But they are reports, and nothing more solid than that. And Corax is still in the eye, no longer quite a man, a thing of blades and living shadow that comes apart into a flock of ravens, still hunting. Vulcan could not be permanently killed, and Kurz had proved it beyond any doubt. So Vulcan did not die. He led his chapter for 1,000 years and more. He was still fighting in the millennium after the heresy, and then he scattered 9 relics across the galaxy as a test of whether his sons were worth returning to, left them the Tome of Fire, which is not a book, but a whole library of encrypted volumes and objects, and walked away. 10,000 years later, 5 of the 9 have been recovered. 4 are still missing. One of the 4 is the stasis casket his own body was laid in. When the last one is found, so the tome says, so the salamanders believe, he comes back. Guilliman was mortally wounded by Fulgrim, a daemon prince by then, with poisoned blades, and was put into a stasis field on Macragge before the poison could finish him. Frozen, in the instant before death, for 10,000 years. And the lion did not vanish when Caliban died, whatever the Imperium was told. He was mortally wounded in single combat with Luther, and the Watchers in the dark carried his broken body away and healed him while he slept. One of the best-kept secrets in the Imperium's history. Except that 2 of them came back, and only 2. Roboute Guilliman was restored, and woke into a galaxy that worships his father as a god, a religion he considers a catastrophe, and one he now has to govern from inside, as Lord Commander of the Imperium. And the lion woke too, 10,000 years on, without his memories, in a galaxy that had turned his return into a fairy tale. They only came back to him when he came face to face with one of the fallen. He is awake now. He has beaten Angron in single combat, driving his sword into the daemon's throat. And the fallen who came to him, the ones who had never truly been chaoses, the ones condemned wrongly, he took into his service rather than his judgment, and they fight beside him now, under a name of their own, the Risen. His own chapter has spent 10,000 years hunting those men, and he answers to nobody, not to Guilliman, not to the Imperium's governors. He holds his own territory, and he goes where he decides to go. 2 out of 18. Meanwhile, all 6 of the demon Primarchs still exist. 4 of them are out in the material galaxy right now, waging war in person, and Lorgar, if the reports are true, makes 5. That is the arc, and it is worth saying plainly what it adds up to. The Space Marine Legions were the most successful military instrument ever built by human hands. In 2 centuries they conquered a galaxy, and they were destroyed, not by the aliens they were made to fight, but by their creator's decision to keep secrets from his sons, and by 9 of those sons deciding that they had been wronged. 9 turned, 9 held, 2 were erased, and the Imperium they left behind has spent 10,000 years defending a corpse on a throne, with a fraction of the strength it started with, in a galaxy that has never once stopped trying to finish the job.